Welcome to this WiseOwl tutorial on looping over files in SQL Server Integration Services. Here's what you'll learn in the tutorial. We'll begin with explaining what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and then show how to delete any old rows in SQL Server tables and how to delete any old files on your hard disk so that you can rerun the package again and again. Then we'll get into the meat of the problem. We'll look at how to loop over files using a for each container, and how to add the file names via a variable into a SQL Server table. We'll then go on to look at conditional copying. So we'll copy only certain files into a separate folder using something called an expression constraint, and then we'll set a variable to count how many files have been copied. Finally, we'll finish off the package by counting up the number of rows in the SQL Server table and displaying the two variable counts we've accumulated in a message box using a script task. So let's get started. In order to be able to create a package, you need to know what it's going to do. So let's have a careful look at what we're trying to achieve in this more ambitious package. I've got a folder here called folder containing files, and it contains some files in the immediate folder, and also, if you drill down, plenty of files in subfolders too. What I want to do is write a package which recursively loops over all the other files in that folder and its subfolders, doing two things to them. The first thing it will do is put the names of the file in a SQL Server table like this. The second thing it will do is it will copy the files to this folder, but it will only copy those files which have got a txt extension. And finally, I want to display a message saying how many files were in the SQL Server table and how many files have been copied to this folder. Now, I've got a package which I created earlier here, so let's see what the final output is going to look like before we create it. The first thing this package will do is get rid of any old rows from the SQL Server table and get rid of any files from the copied folder. So that's just setting up our start conditions. What the package will then do is loop over all the files in the folder and its subfolders, doing three things to each. Firstly, it will add a record to the SQL Server table giving the name of the file. Secondly, it will copy the file to the folder, but only if it ends with the extension txt, so we'll use a precedence constraint to do that. And thirdly, we'll increase the number of files we found by 1 in a variable. After looping over all the files, we'll then be in a position to count up how many rows there are in the SQL Server table, and finally show a message displaying what we've discovered. If I now run this package to show what it does, this is the final message it's going to display. 14 files found, of which 9 text files were copied to the new folder. And sure enough, if we go into SQL Server, you'll see that there are 14 files found, that's why it goes up to 14. And if we go back into Windows Explorer and have a look at our copy files, you'll see there's 9 files in this folder. So that's what we're aiming to achieve. It's time to get started. To make this video shorter than it might have otherwise been, I've set up some things to begin with. So we've already got a table called TBL file in SQL Server, which contains a column called file name, which is a string or text type. It's nvarchar200. And in Integration Services, I've already created a package. I've already created the connection manager to SQL Server and already created an execute SQL task. And what this does is delete all the old rows from the table so that it doesn't keep accumulating more and more rows. And if we just double click on that to edit it, you can see that it uses the connection I've already created to SQL Server, and the SQL statement is to truncate the table, that is to remove any records from it, but leaving the design of the table intact. What I now need to do is to make sure that the copied files folder is empty. At the moment it contains the 9 files I've copied over the previous time I ran the package. So what I'm going to do is to create a file system task to delete all those rows, or all those files. So I can do that by adding a file system task. I'll rename it to say empty folder, a nice short description. And then what I need to do is configure it to say what it's going to do. With a file system task, the best place to start is with the operation. In this case, it's going to be to delete a directory content, but you can see all of the standard file operations you might choose to pick from are listed. So we'll delete the directory content. What I now need to do is say which directory. Sadly, I haven't got a variable containing the path to the source, so what I'm going to do instead is to have to create a connection. I can do that by clicking on the drop arrow, and because I haven't already created a connection, I'm going to create one on the fly now. So I'll choose New Connection. It's an existing folder which I want to work with, and I can click on the Browse button to choose that folder. And I'll just go to it, and then choose OK. If I then choose OK again, I've now got a package which I can run. So let's try it out. It's worked successfully. It's run these two tasks probably in different threads because there's no constraint between them or no flow between them, but it will still have run both the two tasks. And if I now end that, I can have a look at SQL Server, and if I have a look at my file table and look at the rows within it, you can see it's empty. And if I go to my folder in Windows Explorer, you can see that's empty too. So that's a good start. I've set up my position, I've got an empty table and an empty folder. What I now need to do is to loop over all the files, adding the rows into the SQL Server table and copying the files into the folder in Windows Explorer. So what I'm going to do is loop over all the files in the folder, and to do that I need a container, and specifically a for each loop container. So I'll add that from the SSIS toolbox and rename it to say what it's going to do, which is to loop over files. Before I can configure this, what I need to do is do two things. The first is I need to feed the output from the old tasks into it to make sure everything happens in the correct order. And secondly, I need to create a variable to hold the name of each file as we go around the loop. So I'm going to call my variable file name, and it's going to be of type string. We'll see later in this tutorial I'll actually regret leaving that value blank, but for the moment I'll leave it as it is. So now I've created my variable, what I can do is configure my file looping task by double clicking the icon as usual. If I go to the collection tab, I can choose a number of different enumerators, and you can see you can loop over rows, items, XML files. Some of those will come in later packages, later tutorials rather, but for the moment we'll choose to loop over all files. What I then need to do is say which folder I'm looping over, so I can click on the Browse button and select the folder, and having done that I can choose OK. I'm going to choose all files. If I wanted to, I could choose TXT files at this point, but what I wouldn't then be able to do is to put the names of all the files in a separate SQL Server table. It would just loop over the text files. It's important to leave the file name as fully qualified, because I want to pick up not only the name of the file, but also the folder within it, so that I can easily use that for copying files later. And finally, in this dialog box, I want to make sure that I traverse subfolders, so that I don't just loop over all the files in the main folder, the one called folder containing files, but also in any subfolders contained within that, and their subfolders too, and so on recursively. The final thing I need to do in this dialog box is to go to variable mappings and say that in the file name folder that I've created, I want to store the first and only file name returned from looping over the files. It seems rather strange that I can choose an index here, and for the moment I would just assume that you will always store the first and only item in the collection returned, which of course will be index number 0 in the file name. So having done all that, I can choose OK, and if I now run this package, I'm going to ask you to believe that it's stored the name of all 14 files in a variable and finished. I could set up some debugging to check that, but I'm a trusting person, so I'm going to assume that's what's occurring. What we now need to do is to store the names of the files in a SQL Server table, and to do that I need to create a separate task. So having successfully, I hope, looped over all the files, what I now need to do is add the name of each file into a SQL Server table. And to do that, as you can see, I'll add an execute SQL task, which will add the file name to a table. I need to configure this task to say which connection it's going to use. It's going to use the one which rather misleadingly I called X factor, which will connect to the SSIS tutorial database. And it needs to use a SQL statement. So if I click on the three dots to enter the statement, I've already put this in the clipboard. So what it's going to do is insert into the table called TBL file, in the column called file name, the value as specified by a parameter which I'll now create. So if I choose OK to confirm that, what I can now do is go to parameter mapping and add a parameter. Now what I want to do is say that the variable I've created, called file name, which will hold the name of each file as I go around the loop, which is of type, I'll just widen that if I may, it's a string variable, nvarchar, and what it will do is become parameter number 0. So what will happen as I go around the loop is SSIS will automatically put the name of the file as the first parameter to the SQL statement I'm attempting to run, so that when I come to run this statement, the name of the file will be substituted as the first and only parameter in the SQL statement. Let's see if it works. If I now run this package, it seems to work successfully. If I now go to SQL Server and have a look at the table, you can see, sure enough, it's got the 14 rows in. So it's worked successfully. So we've achieved about half of what we set out to. We've added the file name to a SQL Server table. What I now want to do is to add a task which will automatically copy the file, if it's a text file, to the relevant folder. And to do that I need a file system task. So I'll drag that in and make sure it follows on directly from the previous task. And I'll rename it to say copy txt files only. What I now need to do is to configure this task to say what it's going to do. So I can double click on the icon to the left of it. The destination path where I'm copying it to is going to be the connection I've already set up called copy files. If I could just come out of that for a second, you can see that when I created a new connection in the previous file system task up there, it automatically added that connection as part of this package, so I can refer to it again when I'm copying my file. So going back into that. So it's going to copy the files, it's going to overwrite the files in the destination, seems to make sense if there are any. It's going to copy a file, fortunately that was a default already set up, so I didn't need to change that. As to where it's going to get the file from, the answer to that is the file name is already held in a variable. So what I can do is choose that variable from the list, and it will automatically copy the name of the file which this pass around the loop is held in a variable called file name into the folder called copy files. So I can choose OK. There's two problems. The first is quite easily solved. If I let my mouse linger over that, you can see that it says the file name is used as the variable is used as a source or destination is empty. Now this is a bit of a silly message because as I loop over the files, each time around the loop, the file name variable will automatically be populated. So in fact the fact that it's empty at the moment shouldn't be a problem. But because it's an annoying error message, I'm just going to type in something ridiculous like test in there and just to clear the error message. And eventually that message will actually go. It takes a while to catch up. One way I can speed that up is to double click on it and choose OK. The second problem I alluded to is that at the moment it's going to copy all files and not just txt ones. So what I need to do is put a precedence constraint on this arrow so that it only goes on to this task if the file has a txt extension. Now there's two types of constraints you can set. You can set constraints or expressions. Constraints is when you want something to occur if the previous task succeeded, failed or was completed. You can set an expression task when what you want to do is slightly more complicated, as in this case. So I can click on the three dots to create my expressions, and what I want to do is say where the file name ends in txt. All string comparisons in SSIS are case sensitive, so the first thing I'm going to do is go to the list of string functions and find the upper function and drag that in. The second thing I'm going to do is to use the write function. I'm going to just drag that in there to say I'm picking out characters from the rightmost edge of a string of text. The place I'm getting the characters from is the file name, so I can substitute that in there. And the number of characters I'm picking out is 4.txt. So taking the last 4 characters from the file name, if they equal txt, making sure that I type that in uppercase because I've used the upper function to convert it on the left hand side. Now there's one error in that, I don't know if you spotted it, which is because this is a C# type language, when I'm doing a comparison I need to use equals equals, otherwise when I click on the evaluate expression button I'll get an error message. So that's my expression. If I choose OK twice, when I run this package, what it should do is copy the files only where they're text files. So if I now come out of that and go and have a look in Explorer, you can see that it's copied just text files. There's 14 files, but only 9 of them have been copied across. So all's looking very good. What I now want to do is to count up the number of text files copied. And to do that, I can add an expression task here, which will add one to a variable, which I now need to create. So let's go into variables. And what I'll do is I'll add a new variable, which I'll call file count. And it's going to be of type integer. Crucially, its initial value is going to be 0, and each time I find a new text file, I'll add 1 to it. So what I can now do is add an expression task into my loop over files container, and make sure that it follows on from the previous task. And that way, it will only run if this expression constraint is true, i.e. if the file ends in txt. So what this will do is increment number of files, that's what I'll call it. And what I now need to do is go in and configure that to say what it's going to do. So what it's going to do is set the variable called file count equal to the previous value of the variable called file count plus 1. So each time around the loop, the variable value will be increased by 1. Just check that works. It does. And choose OK. And if I now run that, again, there won't be any proof of this, but my expectation is by the time it had finished, this variable called file count held the number 9. What I now need to do is finish up by reporting on 2 values. One is the number of text files copied, and one is the number of rows added to the SQL Server table. What I now want to do is to calculate the total number of files which are added to this table. Now I could have done that by using a variable, just as I did with the number of text files copied, but what I'm going to do instead is create a data flow task after the loop over files container is finished, and use this to count, try one more time, to count the number of rows. And if I double click on this to go into the data flow, the source for this, I'm going to use a source assistant to help me, is going to come directly from my table of files. So I'll call that table of files. And the destination for it is going to be a row count, which if you remember is a handy way of counting up how many rows are on a table. And I'll feed the one into the other. The problem is that the row count needs a variable to hold the information in, and we can't use a file count because that's been used for another purpose. So I need to create a third variable, which I'll call row count. And again, it will be an integer variable. So what I can now do is configure the row count to store the information in the row count variable. So the results of running this data flow task will be a variable holding the number of rows added into the SQL Server table. I can send the output from the container into that row count task, and then finally what I can do is display the information using a script task. So what I'll do is run the count number of rows into my script task and rename this to say show output. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because we've done this in previous tutorials. If I now double click on that, I need to pass in 2 variables into my script task. The first one will be the row count, and the second one will be the file count. If I then choose to edit the script and I'm going to use Visual C# as my language, just because that's the default. What I can now do is to display those two variables. So I'm going to create a variable, an integer variable, which I'll call file count, and set that equal to the value of the variable called file count as passed in. But I need to convert that into an integer so that it will work. I'll just complete that. And what I'm hoping is that that line will automatically store the file count variable in a variable called file count. And I'll just do a very similar thing for the row count, copying and pasting the line to make it a bit easier. And finally, I can display the results. So I can use a message box to show the results. And I'm going to keep it quite short. I'm going to display the file count, and then have a comma in, and then display the row count. Oops, and with a bit of luck that will do it. I've got no underlining, so I'm going to just close that down, choose OK to confirm it, and then run the package. Let's see what happens. So I've run the package, I get the file count is 9 and the row count is 14, so I've copied 9 text files into the copy files folder, but I've added 14 rows into the SQL Server table, which is proof enough for me that everything works successfully. We hope you've enjoyed this tutorial on integration services leaping over files. You can find lots more resources on .NET, SQL Server and Microsoft Office training at www.wiseowl.co.uk.